The year was 1867, and the West was a promise written in dust and blood. In the heart of Willow Creek, the first prairie bank stood as a monument to that promise, its brick facade a stoic rebuke to the untamed land that stretched away on all sides. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of oiled wood and ink. Caleb Boone, a young man whose future felt as vast and certain as his family's ranch, stood at the teller's window, a small velvet box in his hand. Beside him, his wife Sarah, her belly swollen with the life they had made together, traced a pattern on the polished counter with her fingertip. Her smile was the only light he ever needed. "It's perfect, Caleb." She whispered, her eyes fixed on the silver locket he had just presented to her. It was a simple, elegant piece, an heirloom passed down through his mother's line. Engraved on its surface was a single defiant willow tree. Our own little tree to watch over our baby. He closed her hand around it. It's watched over Boone women for generations. Now it's your turn. The calm shattered with the violence of splintering wood and shattering glass. The front doors flew open, and 3 figures burst in their faces, obscured by grimy bandanas. The lead robber, a tall, wiry man, with eyes like chips of flint, brandished a Colt peacemaker. Panic erupted. A clerk screamed. Patrons scrambled for cover, their bodies thudding against the floor. Caleb's reaction was instinctive. He shoved Sarah behind him, his body a shield, his mind a frantic storm of protective rage. Everyone on the floor. Now the leader roared, his voice a raw-edged rasp. His gaze swept the room, cold and calculating. He motioned to his 2 accomplices, who began stuffing cash into canvas bags with brutal efficiency. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He eased Sarah lower, his hand, resting on the gentle curve of her stomach, a silent promise to the child within. He met the robber's eyes for a fleeting second, a silent challenge that passed between them. The man's lips twisted into a sneer behind his bandana. He seemed to relish the fear he commanded. The robbery was swift, practiced. In less than a minute, the bags were full. As the men backed toward the door, the leader's predatory gaze fell on Sarah. Or rather, on the glint of silver clutched in her trembling hand. "What's that you got there, little lady?" he snarled, stepping toward them. Caleb's blood ran cold. "Leave her be," he growled, rising slightly. "Take what you came for and go." The robber laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "I take what I want." He reached for Sarah. Caleb moved a blur of motion, knocking the man's arm away. For a terrifying moment, they were locked in a stalemate, the robber's gun leveled at Caleb's chest. The air crackled with tension. From the street, a shout went up, Sheriff Pratt and his deputy drawn by the commotion. The robber's eyes darted toward the door, his moment of greedy distraction broken. He shoved Caleb back, raising his pistol to fire a warning shot into the ceiling. But in the chaotic shove, his aim faltered. The crack of the gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. It was not followed by the splintering of plaster from above, but by a soft, sickening gasp from behind Caleb. He turned his movements, feeling slow, syrupy, as if wading through a nightmare. Sarah stood frozen for a second, her eyes wide with a surprise that was quickly fading into a deep, hollow emptiness. A dark stain was blossoming on the front of her simple cotton dress. She looked down at it, then up at Caleb, her lips forming his name without a sound. Then her legs gave way. Then her. He caught her, lowering her gently to the floorboards that were suddenly slick and dark. Her hand fell open, the silver locket spilling from her grasp. The robber, his eyes wide with a flicker of what might have been shock or simply annoyance, snatched the locket from the floor. He gave Caleb one last, unreadable look, before turning and vanishing through the shattered doors, leaving behind the scent of gunpowder and the deafening silence of a life extinguished. Caleb heard nothing but the roaring in his own ears. He cradled Sarah's head in his lap, his hands trembling as he pressed them against the wound, a futile attempt to hold back the life that was draining away. Her breath came in shallow, ragged sighs. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky, found his one last time, our baby. She whispered, a tear tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. I'll protect them, Sarah. He choked out the words tearing from his throat. I promise. Her hand twitched, reaching for him, and then fell still. The light in her eyes went out, leaving him alone in a darkness more profound than any night he had ever known. The bank, the town, and the entire world dissolved into a meaningless blur around the cold, silent center of his grief. The promise of the West had been broken, and for Caleb Boone, the future had just died. 5 years later, in the spring of 1872, the ghost of that promise still haunted the vast, silent corners of the Boone Ranch. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, the prairie grasses whispering a constant mournful dirge on the wind. Caleb's world had shrunk to the sturdy fences he tirelessly mended, and the 2 quiet rooms of the house he had built for a family that was now just a memory and a shadow. The man he was had died in that bank. What remained was a hollowed-out shell driven by duty and a grief so deep it had become a part of his very bones. He saw the world through a gray haze. The once vibrant colors of the prairie were now muted, the brilliant sunsets just a daily reminder of another day endured. He lived in fragments of memory. A sharp, sudden noise would send him hurtling back to the echo of the gunshot. The glint of sunlight on a piece of metal would conjure the image of a stolen locket. These memories came in short, sharp bursts like shards of glass in his mind, followed by the long, flowing emptiness of the present. The scorched red dust clinging to the porch rails was the color of the stain on Sarah's dress. The haunting whistle of the wind through the eaves of the too quiet house was the sound of her last breath. His daughter Mary was the one anchor that kept him from drifting away entirely. She was 4 years old, a perfect, painful fusion of him and Sarah. She had his determined chin and Sarah's eyes the color of deep water. Her laughter was the only sound that could momentarily pierce the thick shroud of silence that enveloped the house. But it often served only to remind him of the laughter that was gone forever. He loved her with a fierce, protective ache, a love sharpened by the constant fear that he would fail her just as he had failed her mother. It was this love that drove him into Willow Creek for supplies, a journey he dreaded. The town was a constant reminder, every corner holding a phantom of a life that should have been. The train station was the worst. It was the gateway to the world, a place of arrivals and departures of hope and goodbyes. For Caleb, it was just a place of ghosts. On this particular morning, however, there was something new. A woman and 2 small children were huddled against the station wall, a tiny, desolate island in the stream of townsfolk who flowed past them with averted eyes. Caleb noticed her first from a distance, a still weary figure wrapped in a frayed shawl. As he and Mary drew closer, he saw the details. The woman's cheeks were hollowed by more than just sorrow. It was the stark geography of hunger. Her hands clutched in her lap trembled from more than just the morning chill. Beside her sat 2 children twins, no older than 3. Their small faces smudged with soot, their eyes holding a weariness that belonged to old men who had seen too much of the world. He intended to walk past just like everyone else. Compassion was a luxury he could no longer afford. It was a weakness, an opening for more pain. But Mary, holding his hand, stopped. Her gaze so like her mother's, fixed on the small, huddled family. She saw not ruin or shame, but something simpler, something a child's heart understands without question. She saw people who were hurting. Letting go of his hand, she took a few brave steps forward. The woman Rhea lifted her head, her eyes dark pools of exhaustion and guarded pride widening in surprise. Mary stopped directly in front of her. The platform seemed to fall silent. Even the restless horses tied to the hitching post seemed to still. In a voice both tender and clear, Mary spoke the words that would irrevocably alter the course of all their lives. "Please come with us," she said, her gaze unwavering. "You need a home, A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the few onlookers. Rhea's heart seized in her chest. The child's simple, profound declaration cut through the thick walls of shame she had painstakingly built around herself. She opened her mouth to speak, to refuse to explain that they were fine, that they needed nothing but the lie caught in her throat. Her twins Eli and Lydia looked up, their pale faces illuminated by a sudden fragile flicker of hope. Caleb stepped forward, his boots making a heavy, deliberate sound on the wooden planks. His shadow fell over them, long and imposing. His eyes, stern and searching, settled on Rhea. He took in every detail, the desperate pride in her posture, the way she clutched her children, as if shielding them from the world itself, the ghost of a long, hard road in her eyes. It was a look he knew intimately. It was the same helplessness he had felt kneeling on the floor of the bank, his world bleeding out in his arms. Whispers started to buzz from the townsfolk. Boone's girl talking to a vagrant. He'd be a fool to take them in. Rhea lowered her gaze, the heat of shame crawling up her neck. "We'll manage," she whispered, the words barely audible. She would not accept charity. Not again. Caleb knelt, resting a hand on Mary's shoulder. His daughter looked up at him, her eyes glistening, a silent, powerful plea in their depths. For a long moment, Caleb was caught in the cross-current of his past and present. His grief screamed at him to turn away, to retreat back into the safety of his solitude. But in Mary's plea, he heard an echo of Sarah's boundless compassion. In Rhea's desperation, he saw a reflection of his own brokenness. He straightened his decision, made not out of pity, but out of a reluctant, painful recognition. His voice was clipped, gruff, a shield against the emotion churning within him. One night he said the words sharp. Food, nothing more. Rhea looked up, startled, unsure if she had heard correctly. But he had already turned, lifting Mary to his side, as if the matter was settled. With hesitant, trembling steps, Rhea rose, pulling her children close. Hunger was a more powerful master than pride, and the hope in her children's eyes was a command she could not disobey. She followed him to the wagon every step, a gamble leaving the whispers of the town behind, as she rode toward an unknown future, toward the lonely fortress of the Boone Ranch that rose from the prairie like a promise or a threat. The first few days at the ranch were a delicate, unspoken truce. Rhea moved through the house with the quiet efficiency of a ghost, her every action a careful negotiation with the space she now occupied. She cooked and cleaned not as a guest, but as someone trying to earn her keep, to repay a debt she felt she could never settle. She learned the rhythms of the house, the way the morning light slanted across the kitchen floor, the particular creak of the stairs Caleb descended before dawn, the soft cadence of Mary's breathing as she slept. She kept her own children close, their voices hushed, their play confined to a small corner of the porch, as if their laughter might shatter the fragile peace. Caleb remained distant, a figure of stoic silence. He worked from sunup to sundown, his hands and body occupied with the endless tasks of the ranch, his mind clearly elsewhere. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and practical. Yet Rhea saw the small, involuntary kindnesses. He left a stack of freshly chopped wood by the stove each morning. He ensured there was always fresh milk for the twins. Once he returned from the fields with a handful of wild prairie flowers, which he set on the table without a word, his gaze fixed on a point just past her shoulder, before he turned and left. These were the actions of a man at war with his own nature, his ingrained decency battling the walls he had built around his heart. But the world outside the ranch fences had no patience for such subtleties. Willow Creek was a town that thrived on certainty, and the arrival of a mysterious widow and her children at the Boone Ranch was a disruption they could not tolerate. The whispers that had started at the train station soon swelled into a chorus of judgment. The chief conductor of this chorus was Jedediah Cross. Cross was not merely a gossip. He was a force of nature, a man whose ambition was as vast and unforgiving as the land he sought to conquer. He was the second largest landowner in the county, and the fact that Caleb Boone was the first was a constant galling irritant. He saw Caleb's quiet grief not as a tragedy, but as a weakness to be exploited. Cross was a man of sly words and veiled threats, his smiles thin and cold, his eyes always calculating. He chose his moment carefully. A few days after Ria's arrival, he rode out to the Boone Ranch under the pretense of a neighborly visit. He found Caleb mending a fence line his back to the road. Boone Cross called out, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He dismounted his expensive boots, sinking into the rich soil of Caleb's land. "Heard you've taken in some strays." Caleb didn't turn around immediately. He finished tightening a wire, his movements deliberate. "They're under my roof, Cross. That makes them my concern." Cross chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. He walked closer, casting a proprietary gaze over the sprawling fields. "A man can't afford strays in a hard country, Caleb. Especially not the two-legged kind. Weakness invites wolves." The threat was unmistakable, hanging in the air between them, like the heat shimmering off the plains. Caleb finally turned his eyes level and cold. "And what kind of animal are you, Jedediah?" Cross's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm a survivor. This land doesn't reward charity. It rewards strength. The town is talking. They see a man losing his grip, letting a woman with a questionable past and another man's children into the house his wife built. It's a bad look." From the porch of the house, Ria watched the exchange too far to hear the words, but close enough to read the tension in the set of Caleb's shoulders, the predatory stillness of Cross's posture. She instinctively pulled her shawl tighter, a cold dread seeping into her bones. She was the weakness. Cross spoke of the stray that could bring the wolves down on this place, on this man who had offered her a sliver of sanctuary. That evening, the unspoken truce in the house began to fray. The weight of Cross's visit settled between them, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Ria knew she had to leave. She couldn't be the cause of Caleb's ruin. As she packed her meager belongings in the dim light of her room, her hands trembled. Eli and Lydia slept peacefully, their bellies full, their faces free from the worry that had haunted them for so long. The thought of taking them back to that life of hunger and uncertainty was a physical pain. Her hands brushed against a small, worn leather pouch at the bottom of her satchel, the last remnants of her late husband, Daniel. He had been a man of easy smiles and troubled eyes, always chasing a dream that remained just out of reach. Before he died of a fever a year ago, his last months had been marked by a frantic, secretive energy. He had been involved in something he never spoke of, but which left the scent of fear on his clothes. Driven by a sudden, desperate need to understand the past that clung to her like a shadow, she opened the pouch. Inside, amongst a few worthless trinkets, was a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was a letter written in Daniel's familiar scrawl, but the words were a strange jumble of numbers and symbols, a code. She had found it after his death, but consumed by grief and survival had dismissed it as meaningless. Now, staring at the cryptic message, a chill ran down her spine. The letter hinted at a hidden stash from a job in Willow Creek. It was the reason he had brought them here before he fell ill. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Caleb stood in the doorway, his face etched with weariness. He saw her open satchel, the despair in her eyes. "You're leaving," he stated, his voice flat. Tears welled in her eyes. "I can't bring trouble to your door. I heard what that man said. Cross says what benefits him." Caleb replied, his voice still low, but with a new edge of steel. He stepped into the room, his presence filling the small space. "This is my land, my house. I decide who stays. But the town will talk no matter what I do," he cut in, his gaze intense. "They talked when Sarah died. They said I was cursed. They talked when I kept to myself. They said I was cold. Their words are just wind. Stay." It was not a request. It was a command born of a stubborn pride and something else, something she couldn't yet name. In that moment, Rhea made a choice. She would stay, and she would find out what secrets were hidden in her husband's letter. She owed it to Caleb to know what kind of trouble she might have brought with her. As she tucked the coded letter away, she felt a shift. She was no longer just a survivor adrift on the tides of fate. She was a woman with a purpose and a secret. The days that followed were charged with a new unspoken purpose. While Caleb fought a war on the outside, Rhea fought one on the inside. Jedediah Cross was true to his word. The pressure on Caleb began subtly. A small dam built upstream on Cross's property suddenly diverted a crucial portion of the creek that watered Caleb's southern pasture. When Caleb rode into town to protest, Sheriff Pratt just shrugged, citing complex water rights and a lack of clear evidence. Then the bank where Cross sat on the board sent a polite but firm letter reminding Caleb of an outstanding loan, hinting that they might be forced to call it in early. Contracts for selling his cattle were suddenly delayed, buyers citing unforeseen complications. Willow Creek was slowly, methodically tightening a noose around the Boone Ranch. Caleb met each new obstacle with a grim, unyielding determination. He worked twice as hard, digging new irrigation ditches by hand, his face set like stone. He rode to neighboring counties to find new buyers refusing to be strangled by Cross's influence. A quiet respect began to grow in Rhea as she watched him. He was not a man who broke easily. His fight became her fight. The house was no longer just a sanctuary. It was a fortress they were defending together. Mary and the twins, oblivious to the silent war being waged around them, filled the tense air with their laughter, a constant, beautiful reminder of what was at stake. Meanwhile, Rhea dedicated every spare moment to the coded letter. The scrawled symbols and numbers were a maddening puzzle. By candlelight, long after the children were asleep, she would stare at the page, her mind racing. She started discreetly asking questions in town, piecing together fragments of Willow Creek's recent history. At the general store, while buying thread, she'd ask Martha Lane about any big commotions in the last few years. "Nothing much happens here," Martha would sniff, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Except for that terrible bank robbery a few years back. The one that took Caleb Boone's first wife. A tragedy. Some say he's never been right since. A cold knot formed in Rhea's stomach. A bank robbery. Daniel had been a gambler, always in debt, always looking for one big score. She visited the blacksmith, a kindly old man named Elias, under the pretense of needing a pot mended. She casually mentioned she was new to the area, asked if there was much trouble with outlaws. "Not so much anymore," Elias said, his hammer ringing against the anvil. But 5 years ago, that was different. A real nasty business at the bank. 3 of them. Got away clean all but for the blood they spilled. Killed a young woman pregnant too. Never did catch them. Each new piece of information was like a key turning a lock in the coded message. Rhea began to recognize patterns. Numbers corresponding to date symbols that seemed to represent locations. The job her husband had mentioned was becoming horrifyingly clear. The timing fit perfectly. The location, Willow Creek, was undeniable. One night, a fierce prairie thunderstorm raged outside, the wind howling like a tortured animal, mirroring the tempest in Rhea's soul. She sat at the kitchen table, the letters spread before her, the lantern light flickering. Caleb was out in the storm, checking on the livestock. She was alone with the terrible puzzle. And then she saw it. A sequence of numbers she hadn't understood before. 1867. The year of the robbery. Another set of symbols translated with her newfound knowledge of the town to behind the abandoned church. And then the final devastating piece. The letter spoke of his partner, the leader referred to only by the initials J.C. It described him as a man with a long-standing grudge against the Boone legacy. The letter also mentioned what they had stolen. It wasn't just cash. The partner had taken something personal from the woman, a silver locket with a willow tree on it. Ria's blood ran cold. The breath left her body in a ragged gasp. It couldn't be. Her Daniel, the man who had held her and promised her a better life, had been the getaway driver in the very bank robbery that had destroyed Caleb's world. He was complicit in the murder of Sarah Boone. And his partner, the shooter, the man with a grudge against the Boones, was still here. J.C. Jedediah Cross. The pieces slammed together with brutal, sickening force. Cross wasn't just trying to run Caleb out of business for land. This was something older, something deeply personal. This was a vendetta. And she, Ria, had brought the ghost of that day right back to Caleb's doorstep. She stared at the letter, her husband's familiar handwriting, now looking like the script of a monster. A wave of nausea washed over her. She was living under the roof of the man whose life her husband had helped to shatter. She was caring for the child whose mother her husband had helped to kill. The kindness Caleb had shown her, the home he had given her children, all of it felt like a poisoned gift. Her immediate instinct was to burn the letter, to erase the truth, and pretend it didn't exist. But what then? The danger was still real. Cross was not a man who would simply give up. He was a killer, hiding in plain sight. The back door opened with a gust of wind and rain, and Caleb stepped inside, drenched and weary. He paused, looking at her pale, stricken face, the letter clutched in her white-knuckled hand. "Ria, what is it?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. She looked at him, at the deep lines of grief still carved around his eyes, and the words caught in her throat. How could she tell him? How could she confess that her past was inextricably, violently tangled with his? Telling him the truth would mean dredging up the worst day of his life. It would mean revealing herself as the widow of his wife's killer. He would throw her out. He would have every right to. The sanctuary she had found would be destroyed, and she and her children would be back at the station alone and unprotected. Cross would win, and so in that moment, paralyzed by fear and guilt, Ria made a fateful choice. She folded the letter, her hands shaking, and tucked it away. "It's nothing," she lied, her voice a strained whisper. "Just an old letter. The storm startled me." He searched her face for a long moment, his eyes narrowed with a flicker of doubt. But he was too tired to press the issue. He nodded, accepting her lie, and the chasm of her secret opened between them, dark and treacherous. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this silence was a temporary reprieve. The truth, like the storm outside, was coming, and when it broke, it would threaten to wash them all away. The weight of her secret was a physical burden pressing down on Ria with every passing day. She moved through her chores in a fog of guilt, her every interaction with Caleb colored by her terrible knowledge. His simple acts of kindness now felt like accusations. When he smiled at her children, a rare, fleeting expression that lit up his weary face, she felt a stab of shame so sharp it took her breath away. She was a fraud, a serpent he had unknowingly welcomed into his home. Cross, meanwhile, escalated his campaign. He knew Caleb was resisting, and it seemed to infuriate him. He rode his horse along the border of their properties, a silent, menacing presence. He bought up the debt on Caleb's land from the bank, becoming his sole creditor. The noose was now a collar around Caleb's neck, and Cross held the leash. He was no longer just squeezing. He was preparing to strangle. Ria's quiet investigation had not gone unnoticed. Cross was a man who paid attention to everything, and the widow's sudden interest in a 5-year-old crime had registered on his predatory senses. He suspected she knew something, or was close to finding something out. He decided it was time to force the issue, to remove the final piece from the board. The attack came on a bright, deceptively peaceful afternoon. Ria was hanging laundry on the line, the fresh scent of soap and sunshine filling the air. The children were playing near the barn, their laughter a cheerful counterpoint to the chirping of crickets. Mary was chasing Lydia in a circle, while Eli, ever the little helper, was attempting to stack small pieces of firewood. Rhea smiled a brief moment of reprieve from her anxiety. She turned back to her basket, and in that split second of inattention, it happened. A horse and rider appeared from behind the barn, moving with a silent, terrifying speed. It was one of Cross's ranch hands, a hulking man with a mean, pinched face. Before Rhea could even scream, he had swooped down, grabbing Eli from the ground. The boy let out a single terrified cry before the man's hand clamped over his mouth. The rider spurred his horse, galloping away toward Cross's land before anyone could react. Lydia and Mary stood frozen, their eyes wide with horror. Rhea's world tilted on its axis. A primal scream tore from her throat as she ran, her legs pumping uselessly after the rapidly disappearing horseman. Eli, Caleb heard her scream from the field where he was working. He dropped his tools and ran toward the house, his heart pounding with a familiar, sickening dread. He found Rhea on her knees in the dust, sobbing, pointing a trembling finger toward the horizon. The story came out in a torrent of frantic, broken words. Within the hour, another of Cross's men arrived, carrying a white flag of truce and a message. The terms were simple and brutal. The deed to the Boone Ranch, signed over to Jedediah Cross in exchange for the boy. The exchange was to happen at sundown, at the abandoned church on the edge of town. Caleb was to come alone. As the man delivered the message, he smirked at Rhea. "Boss says to tell you to stop digging around in things that don't concern you. Says your husband learned that lesson the hard way." The blood drained from Rhea's face. It was a confirmation, a deliberate, cruel twist of the knife. Cross knew who she was. He knew she was Daniel's widow. He was flaunting his power, his connection to her past. There were no more secrets to keep. The time for lies was over. Inside the quiet farmhouse, as the afternoon sun slanted low, casting long, mournful shadows across the room, Rhea confessed everything. With tears streaming down her face, her voice cracking with shame, she told Caleb the truth about the letter, about her husband's role as the getaway driver, about Cross being the man who pulled the trigger. She held nothing back, laying the full ugly weight of her past at his feet. "He killed your wife." She whispered the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. "My husband helped him. And now that man has my son." Caleb stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the land his family had worked for generations. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Rhea's ragged sobs. She watched his shoulders, waiting for them to tense with rage, waiting for the explosion, for the condemnation she so richly deserved. She had brought this plague upon his house. When he finally spoke, his voice was unnervingly calm, a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. "He took your son to get my land." He turned slowly, and the look on his face was not what she expected. It was not hatred directed at her. It was a grief so profound, so cold, it seemed to freeze the very air in the room. But beneath the grief, something else was stirring. A fire that had been banked for 5 long years was beginning to glow. The hollow man was gone, replaced by a vessel of pure, focused resolve. He was faced with an impossible choice. He could save his ranch, the legacy his father had built, the only tangible thing he had left of his past. Or he could risk it all to save the son of his enemy's accomplice, the child of the man who helped murder his wife. He looked from Rhea's tear-streaked face to his own daughter, who was huddled with Lydia in a corner, their small forms trembling. He saw the terror in their eyes, and his choice became clear. He had spent 5 years living in the past, a prisoner of his grief. But the future was right here in this room, in the faces of these children. He had made a promise to a dying Sarah that he would protect their child. He now realized that promise extended further. It was a promise to protect innocence itself. His moral growth, nurtured by Rhea's quiet strength and the children's unconditional love, solidified into a single, unshakable decision. He would not sacrifice a child for dirt and wood. He would not become a man like Cross. "Get the children ready," he said, his voice hard as iron. He walked to the old wooden mantelpiece and took down the rifle that had sat there untouched for 5 years. He checked the action, his movements swift and sure. I'm not giving him my land. He met Ria's eyes, and for the first time, she saw the man he must have been before the tragedy, a man of unbending strength and fierce honor. "I'm getting your son back." The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, as a furious dust storm gathered on the horizon, the wind beginning to howl its prelude to chaos. Caleb rode toward the abandoned church, not as a victim, but as an instrument of a long-delayed justice. The old church stood on a lonely bluff overlooking Willow Creek, its steeple a jagged finger pointing at the bruised and churning sky. The wind, a precursor to the coming storm, tore at the loose shingles and rattled the boarded-up windows, creating a symphony of groans and shrieks. Dust devils danced across the parched earth. It was a place between heaven and hell, a fitting stage for the final act. Caleb dismounted a quarter-mile away, tethering his horse in a gully. He moved on foot, his rifle held low, his body a dark shape against the dying light. The storm was closing in fast, the air growing thick with sand, stinging his eyes and coating his tongue with grit. Visibility was dropping with every gust. This was his advantage. The storm was an ally, a chaotic force that could disrupt a planned execution. Inside the church, Jedediah Cross paced before the splintered altar, Eli held firmly in the crook of one arm. The boy was silent, his eyes wide with a terror that had exhausted his tears. 2 of Cross's men stood guard by the door, their faces tense. "He's late," one of them muttered, peering out into the swirling dust. "He'll come," Cross said with absolute certainty, his voice a smug rasp. The great and noble Caleb Boone wouldn't abandon a child. It's his fatal flaw, the same flaw that ran through his father. Caleb slipped through a broken window at the back of the church, his movements as silent as the settling dust. He crept into the shadows of the choir loft, the old wood groaning softly under his weight. From his vantage point, he could see the scene below Cross, Eli, and the 2 guards. The air was thick with the smell of decay and tension. The main doors burst open with a blast of wind and sand, and Caleb's heart leaped into his throat. But it wasn't him. It was Sheriff Pratt, his pistol drawn, his face a grim mask of determination. Ria had gone to him, her story finally emboldening the cautious lawman to act. Cross laughed, a harsh grating sound. Pratt, always a step behind. "You think you can stop this? This is bigger than you." He pressed the barrel of his pistol to Eli's small head. "Drop the gun, Sheriff, or the boy's brains will decorate this holy place." Pratt hesitated, his face a mask of conflict. From the loft, Caleb knew this was his only chance. He raised his rifle, the sight finding Cross's shoulder. He could end this with one shot. But the risk to Eli was too great. He had to be smarter. He had to use the environment Cross thought he controlled. "It's the land you want." Cross, Caleb's voice boomed from the shadows above, startling everyone. "Let the boy and the sheriff go. This is between you and me." Cross's head snapped up, his eyes searching the darkness of the loft. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Boone, finally. I knew you couldn't resist. You're right. This has always been about you and me. Or rather about your name." The storm hit with full force. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and sand blasted against the windows, some of which shattered, letting the tempest pour into the church. The lanterns flickered wildly, casting dancing, monstrous shadows. In the chaos, Cross revealed his true poisoned motive. "You think this is about land, about money?" he shouted over the roar of the wind. "This is about justice. Your father, that self-righteous pillar of the community, he ruined my family. He called in a loan my father couldn't pay, and took everything we had. Our ranch, our pride, our future. We were left with nothing but dust. I grew up watching my father drink himself to death in shame, all because of the great Boone name. His voice was raw with decades of festering hatred. This was not the cold calculation of a businessman. It was the hot rage of a wronged son. The bank robbery. It was never about the cash, Cross confessed, his eyes blazing with a fanatical light. It was about humbling you, taking your inheritance, making you feel what I felt. You were supposed to lose everything just like I did. He looked down at Eli, then back toward the loft. Killing your wife was an accident. A stupid, regrettable accident. My quarrel was never with her. It was always with you. With the name you carry. The revelation struck Caleb with the force of a physical blow. This entire nightmare, the death of his wife, the 5 years of hollow grief, was the result of a vendetta against his father. Sarah had been a casualty, an unintended consequence in a war he never knew was being fought. The transformation of the villain was complete. Cross was not just a greedy monster. He was a tragic figure twisted by a pain that mirrored Caleb's own. But Caleb's own pain had been tempered by love and responsibility. Cross had let his consume him, using the storm's fury as cover. Caleb acted. He kicked a stack of old, rotting hymn books from the edge of the loft. They crashed to the floor on the far side of the church, drawing the attention of the 2 guards. As they turned, Pratt dove for cover. In that same instant, Caleb fired not at Cross, but at the thick rope holding the church's heavy cracked bell in the steeple directly above him. The rifle shot was almost lost in the howl of the wind. The frayed rope snapped. With a groaning screech of tortured wood, the massive bronze bell plunged downward, crashing through the rotted beams of the choir loft and slamming onto the main floor right where Cross's men had been standing. They scrambled away with yells of terror, disoriented by the dust and the sheer shock. In that moment of chaos, Caleb leaped from the loft landing in a roll on the sandy floor below. He came up running. Cross, stunned, turned his pistol toward Caleb, but he was too slow. Caleb crashed into him, driving him back against the altar. The impact knocked Eli from Cross's grasp. The boy tumbled to the floor, and Sheriff Pratt was on him in a second, scooping him up and pulling him to safety. Caleb and Cross were locked in a desperate, brutal struggle. This was not about guns anymore. It was about raw physical rage. Caleb, fueled by 5 years of suppressed grief and a father's protective fury, fought with a strength he hadn't known he possessed. He disarmed Cross, sending the pistol skittering into the darkness. They traded blows, their grunts lost in the storm. Finally, Caleb landed a decisive punch, and Cross crumpled to the floor, defeated and gasping amidst the debris. The storm began to subside as quickly as it had arrived. The wind's shriek softened to a mournful sigh. Dust settled in the eerie silence. Caleb stood over Cross's chest, heaving his knuckles bloody. He had won. He had rescued the boy and faced his wife's killer. But there was no triumph, only a vast, aching emptiness. He had not destroyed a monster. He had simply defeated a broken man. Sheriff Pratt clapped a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "It's over, Caleb. It's finally over." Caleb retrieved Eli, holding the trembling boy close. He looked at the pathetic figure of Jedediah Cross being hauled to his feet by the sheriff. He had his justice, but it wouldn't bring Sarah back. It wouldn't erase the past. All it could do was clear the way for the future. He carried Eli out of the ruined church and into the clean, rain-washed air of the new evening. The ride back to the ranch was a long, heavy silence. The prairie, washed clean by the storm, seemed to be breathing a sigh of relief. Eli slept exhausted in Caleb's arms, his small body, a warm, solid weight of life, reclaimed. When they arrived, Rhea ran from the house, her face a mess of tears and dirt. She threw her arms around Eli, burying her face in his hair, her body shaking with convulsive sobs of relief. Later, after the children were finally safely asleep, Caleb and Rhea sat at the kitchen table. The space between them was filled with the ghosts of everything that had been said and done. The truth about her husband, about Sarah's death, about Cross's vendetta lay exposed between them. Rhea finally broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper. I don't expect you to forgive me, Caleb. Or him. I'm so sorry. Caleb looked at his hands, calloused and bruised from the fight. He thought of the blind rage that had filled him and the profound emptiness that followed. He thought of Cross, a man so consumed by the past that he had destroyed his own future. He refused to walk that same path. He lifted his gaze to meet hers. His eyes were clear, the haunted gray fog finally beginning to lift. Your husband made his choices, Rhea, he said, his voice steady and measured. He chose revenge and greed, and he paid for it. You have made yours. You chose to protect your children. You chose to tell the truth, even when it was hard. That is all that matters now. It was not a declaration of love, not yet. It was something more fundamental. It was an act of grace. It was a conscious decision to let go of the venom of the past, to stop letting the dead dictate the lives of the living. It was forgiveness, not for Daniel, but for themselves. In that quiet kitchen, surrounded by the sleeping sounds of their children, and they chose a new future over a tainted past. The storm was over, both outside and within. Months passed. The prairie bloomed, shaking off the last vestiges of a harsh winter and embracing a vibrant, hopeful spring. The town of Willow Creek, shaken from its complacent judgment by the truth of Jedediah Cross's villainy, began to see the family at the Boone Ranch in a new light. Cross was gone, sentenced to a life in prison, and his dark influence over the town was broken. People who had once whispered and sneered now offered quiet nods of respect. Martha Lane even offered Rhea a small bag of her best candies for the children, a peace offering that spoke volumes. The house on the Boone Ranch was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of life, with the pitter-patter of 3 sets of small feet, with laughter that echoed in the rafters, with the low murmur of conversation late into the evening. Caleb and Rhea had built a fragile bridge across the chasm of their shared tragedy, a bridge made of shared purpose, mutual respect, and a slowly blossoming tender affection. One Sunday morning, they rode into town and stood before the preacher in the now-repaired church. The pews were filled with townsfolk, their presence a quiet testament to the community's acceptance. Caleb and Rhea's vows were not the flowery words of new lovers, but the simple, solid promises of 2 people who had weathered the worst of storms together and had come out the other side, scarred but whole. They acknowledged the past they had overcome and pledged themselves to the future they would build together. Mary Lydia and Eli stood between them, a small, fierce unit, the living heart of their new family. A few weeks after the wedding, on a quiet afternoon, Caleb took Rhea by the hand and led her to a gentle rise at the edge of his property. A single weathered headstone stood beneath the shade of a lone willow tree. Sarah Boone, beloved wife and mother. The air was still. For a long moment, Caleb simply stood there, his gaze on the name carved into the stone. The sharp, agonizing grief that had been his constant companion for 5 years had softened into a quiet, gentle ache of memory. He was no longer haunted by her absence. He was grateful for the time they had shared. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket. Sheriff Pratt had recovered it from Cross's belongings. It was tarnished and slightly dented, but the engraved willow tree was still visible. He knelt and gently placed the locket on the headstone, letting it rest against the cool stone. "Goodbye, Sarah," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, but free of pain. It was a final peaceful farewell to that chapter of his life. He was letting her go, not from his memory, but from the prison of his grief. He stood up and turned to Rhea, who watched him with tears in her eyes, understanding the profound significance of the moment. He took her hand, his touch warm and steady. From his other pocket he produced a simple, slender gold band. It was not a replacement for the heirloom he had lost, but something new, something that belonged only to them. He slid it onto her finger, a perfect fit. He looked at her, at this woman who had come into his life like a storm and had somehow washed it clean. He saw not the widow of his enemy, but his wife, his partner, the mother of his children. He saw his future. The vast, empty prairie no longer felt like a mirror of his soul. It felt like a promise again, a wide open space where a new life could grow strong and resilient, its roots nourished by forgiveness and love.